Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, Pete Walker, Chapter 1, The Journey of Recovering from Cptsd. I wrote this book from the perspective of someone who has complex post-traumatic stress disorder, Cptsd, and who has experienced a great reduction of symptoms over the years. I also wrote it from the viewpoint of someone who has discovered many silver linings in the long, winding, bumpy road of recovering from Cptsd. I've also seen this type of recovery in a number of my friends and many long-term clients. First, the good news about Cptsd. It is a learned set of responses and a failure to complete numerous important developmental tasks. This means that it is environmentally, not genetically caused. In other words, unlike most of the diagnosis is confused with, it is neither inborn nor characterological. As such, it is learned. It is not inscribed in your DNA. It is a disorder caused by nurture, or rather lack of it, not nature. This is especially good news because what is learned can be unlearned or vice versa. What was not provided by your parents can now be provided by yourself and others. Recovery from Cptsd typically has important self-help and relational components. The relational piece can come from others, friends, partners, teachers, therapists, therapeutic groups, or any combination of these. I like to call this reparenting by committee. I must emphasize, however, that some survivors of Cptsd engendering families were so thoroughly betrayed by their parents that it may be a long time, if ever, before they can trust another human being enough to engage in relational healing work. When this is the case, pets, books, and online therapeutic websites can provide significant relational healing. This book describes a multimodal treatment approach to Cptsd. It is orientated toward the most prevalent kind of Cptsd, the kind that comes from growing up in a severely abusive and/or neglectful family. In this vein, the book describes a journey of healing the damage that occurs when you suffer traumatizing abuse and abandonment. Traumatizing abuse and abandonment can occur on verbal, emotional, spiritual, and/or physical levels. Moreover, sexual abuse is especially traumatizing. I believe that we have an epidemic of traumatizing families. Current estimates posit that 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys are sexually abused before they enter adulthood, and recent statistics from the Kim Foundation report that 26% of Americans over 18 have been diagnosed with a mental disorder. When abuse or neglect is severe enough, any one category of it can cause the child to develop Cptsd. This is true even in the case of emotional neglect if both parents collude in it, as we'll see in Chapter 5. When abuse and neglect is multidimensional, the severity of the Cptsd worsens accordingly. Subheading: Definition of Complex PTSD. Cptsd is a more severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder. It is delineated from this better-known trauma syndrome by 5 of its most common and troublesome features: emotional flashbacks, toxic shame, self-abandonment, a vicious inner critic, and social anxiety. Emotional flashbacks are perhaps the most noticeable and characteristic feature of Cptsd. Survivors of traumatizing abandonment are extremely susceptible to painful emotional flashbacks, which, unlike PTSD, do not typically have visual component. Emotional flashbacks are sudden and often prolonged regressions to the overwhelming feeling states of being an abused/abandoned child. These feeling states can include overwhelming fear, shame, alienation, rage, grief, and depression. They also include unnecessary triggering of our fight-flight instincts. It is important to state here that emotional flashbacks, like most things in life, are not all or none. Flashbacks can range in intensity from subtle to horrific. They can also vary in duration, ranging from moments to weeks on end, where they devolve into what many therapists call a regression. Finally, a more clinical and extensive definition of Cptsd can be found on page 121 of Judith Herman's seminal book, Trauma and Recovery. Subheading: An example of an emotional flashback. As I write this, I recall the first emotional flashback that I was ever able to identify, although I did not identify it until about 10 years after it occurred. At the time of the event, I was living with my first serious partner. The honeymoon phase of our relationship came to a screeching halt when she unexpectedly started yelling at me for something I no longer recalled. What I do most vividly recall was how the yelling felt. It felt like a fierce hot wind. I felt like I was being blown away, like my insides were being blown out as a flame on a candle is blown out. Later, when I first heard about auras, I flashed back to this and felt like my aura had been completely stripped from me. At the time itself, I also felt completely disorientated, unable to speak, respond, or even think. I felt terrified, shaky, and very little. Somehow I finally managed to toddle to the door and get out of the house, where I eventually slowly pulled myself together. As I said earlier, it took me 10 years to figure out this confusing and disturbing phenomenon was an intense and emotional flashback. Some years later, I came to understand the nature of this type of regression. I realized it was a flashback to the hundreds of times my mother, in full homicidal visage, blasted me with her rage into terror, shame, dissociation, and helplessness. Emotional flashbacks are also accompanied by intense arousals of the fight-flight instinct, along with hyperarousal of the sympathetic nervous system, the half of the nervous system that controls arousal and activation. When fear is the dominant emotion in a flashback, the person feels extremely anxious, panicky, or even suicidal. When despair predominates, a sense of profound numbness, paralysis, and desperation to hide may occur. A sense of feeling small, young, fragile, powerless, and helpless is also commonly experienced in an emotional flashback, and all the symptoms are typically overlaid with humiliating and crushing toxic shame. Subheading: Toxic shame, the veneer of an emotional flashback. Toxic shame, explored enlighteningly by John Bradshaw in Healing the Shame That Binds, obliterates the Cptsd survivor's self-esteem with an overwhelming sense that he is loathsome, ugly, stupid, or fatally flawed. Overwhelming self-disdain is typically a flashback to the way he felt when suffering the contempt and visual skewering of his traumatizing parent. Toxic shame can also be created by constant parental neglect and rejection. Early in my career, I worked with David, a handsome, intelligent man who was a professional actor. One day, David came to see me after an unsuccessful audition. Beside himself, he burst out, "I never let on to anyone, but I know that I'm really very ugly. It is so stupid that I'm trying to be an actor when I'm so painful to look at." I will never forget how shocked and disbelieving I felt at first, that such a handsome person could feel ugly, but further exploration brought me understanding. David's childhood was characterized by a broad spectrum abuse and neglect. He was the last and unwanted child of a large family, and his alcoholic father repeatedly attacked and looked at him with disgust. To make matters worse, his family imitated his father and frequently humiliated him with heavy doses of contempt. His older brother's favorite jibe, accompanied by a nauseated grimace, was, "I can't stand the sight of you. You make me want to vomit." Toxic shame can obliterate your self-esteem in the blink of an eye. In an emotional flashback, you can regress instantly into feeling and thinking that you're as worthless and contemptible as your family perceived you. When you are stranded in a flashback, toxic shame devolves into the intensely painful alienation of the abandonment melange, a rolling morass of shame, fear, and depression. The abandonment melange is the fear and toxic shame that surrounds and interacts with the abandonment depression. The abandonment depression itself is the deadened feeling of helplessness and hopelessness that afflicts traumatized children. Toxic shame also inhibits us from seeking comfort and support. In a reenactment of the childhood abandonment, we are flashing back to we often isolate ourselves and helplessly surrender to an overwhelming feeling of humiliation. If you are stuck viewing yourself as worthless, defective, or despicable, you are probably in an emotional flashback. This is typically also true when you are lost in self-hate and virulent self-criticism. Numerous clients and respondents to my website tell me that the concept of the emotional flashback brings them a great sense of relief. They report that for the first time they are able to make sense of some of their troubled lives. A common comment has been, quote, "Now I understand why all the psychological and spiritual approaches I've pursued had so few answers for me," unquote. Many also note feeling freed from a shaming list of misdiagnoses that have been given to them by themselves or others. This in turn has aided them in ridding themselves of the self-destructive habit of amassing evidence of their own defectiveness or craziness. Many also report a quantum leap in their motivation to challenge the learned habits of self-hate and self-disgust. Subheading: List of common CPTSD. Oh gosh. Subheading: List of common CPTSD symptoms. Survivors may not experience all of these. Varying combinations are common. Factors affecting this are your 4F type and your childhood abuse/neglect pattern. Emotional flashbacks. Tyrannical inner and or outer critic. Toxic shame. Self-abandonment. Social anxiety. Abject feelings of loneliness and abandonment. Fragile self-esteem. Attachment disorder. Developmental arrests. Relationship difficulties. Radical mood vacillations, e.g. pseudocyclothymia, see Chapter 12. Dissociation via distracting activities or mental processes. Hair-triggered flight/fight response. Oversensitivity to stressful situations. Suicidal ideation. Subheading: Suicidal ideation. Suicidal ideation is a common phenomenon in CPTSD, particularly during intense or prolonged flashbacks. Suicidal ideation is depressed thinking or fantasizing about wanting to die. It can range from active suicidality to passive suicidality. Passive suicidality is far more common with CPTSD survivors who I have known, and it ranges from wishing you were dead to fantasizing about ways to end your life. When lost in suicidal ideation, the survivor may even pray to be delivered from this life, or fantasize about being taken by some calamitous act of fate. He may even think or obsess, without being serious, of stepping in front of a car or jumping off a building. Fantasy typically ends, however, without serious intent to kill yourself. This is as opposed to active suicidality, where the person is actively proceeding in the direction of taking her life. I'm discussing passive suicidality because it does not merit the same kind of alarm as active suicidality. Passive suicidality is typically a flashback to early childhood when our abandonment was so profound that it was natural for us to wish that God or somebody or something would just put an end to it all. When the survivor catches himself in suicidal reverie, he will benefit from seeing it both as an emblem of how much pain he is in and as a sign of particularly intense flashback. This can then direct him to use the flashback management steps in Chapter 8. If, however, flashback management does not help and suicidality becomes increasingly active, please call the National Suicide Hotline or visit www.suicidepreventionlifeline.org, because this is a flashback that you may need help managing and you will get good help there. Skilled therapists and caregivers learn to discriminate between active and passive suicidal ideation and do not panic and catastrophize when encountering the latter. Instead, the counselor invites the survivor to explore his suicidal thoughts and feelings, knowing that in most cases, verbal ventilation of the flashback pain underneath, it will deconstruct the suicidality. In the much less common scenario of active suicidality, encouraging verbal ventilation will also help the therapist or helper discern if there is indeed a real risk, and if the action needs to be taken to protect the survivor. Subheading: What you may have been misdiagnosed with. I once heard a renowned traumatologist, John Breer, quip that if Cptsd were ever given its due, the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, used by all health mental professionals, would shrink from its dictionary-like size to the size of a thin pamphlet. In other words, the role of traumatized childhoods in most adult psychological disorders is enormous. I've witnessed many clients with Cptsd misdiagnosed with various anxiety and depressive disorders. Moreover, many are also unfairly and inaccurately labelled with bipolar, narcissistic, codependent, autistic spectrum, and borderline disorders. This is not to say that Cptsd does not sometimes co-occur with these disorders. Further confusion also arises in the case of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, as well as obsessive/compulsive disorder, both of which are sometimes more accurately described as fixated flight responses to trauma. See the 4Fs below. This is also true of ADD, attention deficit disorder, and some depressive and dissociative disorders which similarly can more accurately be described as fixated freeze responses to trauma. Furthermore, this is not to say that those misdiagnosed do not have issues that are similar and correlative with the disorders above. The key point is that these labels are incomplete and unnecessarily shaming descriptions of what the survivor is actually afflicted with. Reducing Cptsd to panic disorder is like calling food allergies chronic itchy eyes. Over-focusing treatment on the symptoms of panic in the former case and eye health in the latter does little to get at the root causes. Feelings of panic or itchiness in the eyes can be masked with medication, but all the associated problems that cause these symptoms remain untreated. Moreover, most of the diagnoses mentioned above are typically treated as innate characterological defects rather than as learned maladaptations to stress. Adaptations that survivors were forced to learn as traumatized children. And most importantly, because these adaptations were learned, they can often be extinguished or significantly diminished and replaced with more functional adaptations to stress. In this vein, I believe that many substance and process addictions also begin as misguided maladaptations to parental abuse and abandonment. They are early adaptations that are attempts to soothe and distract from the mental, emotional, and physical pain of Cptsd. Subheading: Origins of Cptsd. How do traumatically abused and or abandoned children develop Cptsd? While the origin of Cptsd is most often associated with the extended periods of physical and or sexual abuse in childhood, my observations convince me that ongoing verbal and emotional abuse also causes it. Many dysfunctional parents react contemptuously to a baby or a toddler's plaintive call for connection and attachment. Contempt is extremely traumatizing to a child, and at best extremely noxious to an adult. Contempt is a toxic cocktail of verbal and emotional abuse, a deadly amalgam of denigration, rage, and disgust. Rage creates fear, and disgust creates shame in the child in a way that soon teaches her to refrain from crying out, from ever asking for attention. Before long, the child gives up on seeking any kind of help or connection at all. The child's bid for bonding and acceptance is thwarted, and she is left to suffer in the frightened despair of abandonment. Particularly abusive parents deepen the abandonment trauma by linking corporal punishment with contempt. Slaveholders and prison guards typically use contempt and scorn to destroy their victims' self-esteem. Slaves, prisoners, and children who are made to feel worthless and powerless devolve into learned helplessness and can be controlled with far less energy and attention. Cult leaders also use contempt to shrink their followers into absolute submission after luring them in with brief phases of fake unconditional love. Furthermore, Cptsd can also be caused by emotional neglect alone. This key theme is explored at length in Chapter 5. If you notice that you are berating yourself because your trauma seems insignificant compared to others, please skip ahead to this chapter and resume reading here upon completion. Emotional neglect also typically underlies most traumatizations that are more glaringly evident. Parents who routinely ignore or turn their backs on a child's calls for attention, connection, or help abandon their child to unimaginable amounts of fear, and the child eventually gives up and succumbs to depressed, death-like feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. These types of rejection simultaneously magnify the child's fear and eventually add a coating of shame to it. Over time, this fear and shame begets a toxic inner critic that holds the child, and later the adult, totally responsible for his parents' abandonment, until he becomes his own worst enemy and descends into the bowels of Cptsd. Subheading: More about trauma. Trauma occurs when attack or abandonment triggers a fight-flight response so intensely that a person cannot turn it off once the threat is over. He becomes stuck in an adrenalized state. His sympathetic nervous system is locked on, and he cannot toggle into the relaxation function of the parasympathetic nervous system. One common instance of this occurs when a child is attacked and hurt by a bully after school. He may remain in hypervigilant, fearful state until someone takes action to ensure him that he will not be re-victimized, and until someone helps him realize the hyperactivation in his nervous system. If the child has learned through experience that he can come to at least one of his parents when he is hurting, frightened, or needing help, he will tell mum or dad about it. With them, he will grieve the temporary death of this sense of safety in the world by verbally ventilating, crying, and angering about it. Chapter 11 expands on these processes of grieving. Moreover, his parent will report the bully and take steps to assure it will not happen again, and the child will typically be released from the trauma. He will naturally relax back into the safety of parasympathetic nervous system functioning. Simple one-incident traumas can often be resolved relatively easy if Cptsd is not already present. If, however, the bullying happens on numerous occasions and the child does not seek help, or if the child lives in an environment so dangerous that the parent is powerless to ensure a modicum of safety, it may take more than parental comforting to release the trauma. If the trauma is not too continuous over too long a time, a short course of therapy may be all that's needed to resolve the trauma, provided, of course, the danger in the environment can effectively be remediated. When the trauma, however, is repetitive and ongoing and no help is available, the child may become so frozen in trauma that the symptoms of simple PTSD begin to set in. This can also occur during the prolonged trauma of combat or entrapment in a cult or domestic violence situation. If, however, a person is also afflicted by ongoing family abuse or profound emotional abandonment, the trauma will manifest as a particularly severe emotional flashback because he already has Cptsd. This is particularly true when his parent is also a bully. Subheading: The 4 Fs: Fight, Flight, Freeze, and Fawn. Earlier I mentioned the fight-flight response that is an innate automatic response to danger in all human beings. A more complete and accurate description of this instinct is the fight/flight/freeze/fawn response. The complex nervous system wiring of this response allows a person in danger to react in 4 different ways. A fight response is triggered when a person suddenly responds aggressively to something threatening. A flight response is triggered when a person responds to a perceived threat by fleeing, or symbolically by launching into hyperactivity. A freeze response is triggered when a person, realizing resistance is futile, gives up, numbs out into dissociation, and/or collapses as if accepting the inevitability of being hurt. A fawn response is triggered when a person responds to a threat by trying to be pleasing or helpful in order to appease and forestall an attacker. This fourfold response potential will heretofore be referred to as the 4 Fs. Traumatized children often overgravitate to one of these response patterns to survive, and as time passes, these 4 modes become elaborated into entrenched defensive structures that are similar to narcissistic fight, obsessive/compulsive flight, dissociative, freeze, or codependent, fawn defenses. These structures help children survive their horrific childhoods, but leave them very limited and narrow in how they respond to life. Even worse, they remain locked in these patterns in adulthood when they no longer need to rely so heavily on one primary response pattern. It is important to understand that variances in childhood abuse/neglect patterns, birth order, and genetic predispositions result in people polarizing to their particular 4F type. In the next section, we will explore examples of how children are driven into these defenses by traumatizing parents. The 4 children in the vignette below match the 4 basic types of trauma survivors. Bob is fight narcissistic, Carol is the flight obsessive compulsive, Maud is the freeze dissociative, and Sean is the fawn codependent. Subheading: The 4Fs in a Cptsd-inducing family. Carol was the scapegoat of her family. Narcissistic and borderline parents typically chose at least one child to be the designated. The 4Fs in the Cptsd-inducing family. Carol was the scapegoat of her family. Narcissistic and borderline parents typically choose at least one child to be designated family scapegoat. Scapegoating is the process by which a bully offloads and externalizes his pain, stress, and frustration by attacking a less powerful person. Typically, scapegoating brings the bully some momentary relief. It does not, however, effectively metabolize or release his pain, and scapegoating soon resumes as the bully's internal discomfort resurfaces. Wilhelm Reich, in his brilliant book, The Psychology of Fascism, explains how scapegoating occurs on a continuum that stretches from the persecution of the targeted child by a bullying parent to the horrific scapegoating of the Jews by the Nazis. In especially dysfunctional families like Carol's, the scapegoating parent often organizes the rest of the family to also gang up on the scapegoat. Carol discovered a great deal about her early childhood from watching home videos. Her parents were so narcissistically oblivious that they unabashedly recorded many incidents of Carol being verbally and emotionally abused by them. This was usually in the background of recordings of the performances of their favorite child, her older brother. Several narcissistic parents are rarely embarrassed by their aggressive behavior. They feel entitled to punish a child for anything that displeases them, no matter how unreasonable it might appear to an impartial observer. Carol's parents started in on her early by disdainfully blaming her for soiling her diaper before she was even 1. By the time she was 3, she had been so frequently punished for making noise while talking and playfully exploring her house that her constant state of fear generated an